The progressive no argument has percolated in the background of the voice debate. The main proponents include people such as Lydia Thorpe, so it's worth looking at what exactly it entails. Now, as far as I can discern, there are several key arguments, and if you think I've missed anything or mischaracterized anything, well, let me know that in the comments below. In essence, as far as I can tell, the progressive no case is that the voice is something like a sham. It's a mere veneer to cover up underlying problems. In so doing, it gives the government an excuse to wash its hands of the underlying issues while presenting the facade of consultation. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that I agree with all of these arguments. I'm simply doing my best to explain them as I've been able to discern them and as I see them, in part because it's important to look at myriad perspectives when voting. Now, we should start by noting that there is an extreme version of the progressive no case, which seems to assert that there should be a system of dual sovereignty or an indigenous-only sovereignty. It appears to be relatively extreme, but some people seem to argue it. It's also likely to be a complete non-starter. It's implausible, for example, that Australia would establish a separate criminal justice system. There's also no chance of Australia simply ceasing to exist. So we can put that argument to the side and address some of the more substantive ones that seem to keep coming up. The first major argument that the progressive no camp suggests is that the voice is inadequate, and there should be a treaty instead, and the treaty should be the first port of call. Now, I'm not entirely sure where this argument comes from, given that the Uluru Statement indicates that a voice would precede a treaty, and the treaty is the culmination of the agenda. It would appear from the Uluru Statement and the background documents that a voice would be part of the consultation that would give rise to a treaty. Now, the progressive no case, therefore, appears to rest on the assumption that the voice would be a band-aid and a panacea, and as such, a progressive no argument is that the voice would be seen as sufficient and would halt momentum toward a treaty. That is, instead of going that next step and getting a treaty, when one has the voice, people simply won't bother. Now, like I've said, I'm not totally sure that I agree with the progressive no argument here. After all, voice advocates have indicated that they intend to use a voice to bring about a treaty and potentially financial reparations. These people include advocates such as Megan Davis and Thomas Mayo. Now, perhaps the progressive no assumption is that these advocates will lose their zeal once the voice exists, or that the voice will push for the treaty in an ineffective way, or push for a treaty that simply doesn't do anything. The progressive no argument appears to assume that the voice will become ineffective in that manner. Now, like I've said, I'm not totally sure I agree with this. After all, it does appear that many advocates want to push for a treaty. It appears the government is already funding movements toward a treaty via earmarking $6 million for a Makarrata Commission, of which it's already spent about $1 million. So it does appear that the voice would be a key step toward a treaty, and I'm not totally sure why the progressive no thinks it would be otherwise. Second, the progressive no camp seems to suggest that the voice might be a rubber stamp and might be co-opted by the government. The assertion here is that the government could appoint members to the voice. Therefore, they could appoint friendly people that they could control. Now, suppose the government wants to increase resources activity within Indigenous areas. Well, then the government might solicit opinions from the voice, and it might use those opinions as a rubber stamp to make it look as if they have done adequate consultation. Now, this of course rests on the assumption that the government appoints people to the voice entity, and that those appointees are in fact friendly toward the government. It also rests on the assumption that the members of the voice would not necessarily represent all Indigenous Australians. They would represent perhaps their own specific interests and or those of the government. Now, this argument is certainly a theoretical possibility. Certainly, if the voice members are appointed, then the government would presumably appoint people that are aligned with it. This could be the case under either the ALP or the coalition, whoever happens to be in power at that time. Given that the ALP is currently in power, presumably the ALP would appoint people that are friendly toward its policies. Now, this may not actually happen. We don't know whether the members of the voice are going to be appointed or elected. We don't know whether any appointments would be bipartisan or simply selected by the government of the day. It's not clear at this point. Now, that's because the legislation underlying the voice simply doesn't exist at this point, so we don't know how exactly it is going to operate. Now, the government could in theory put a project to the voice if and when the voice ultimately exists. Now, approval from a friendly voice body would then potentially give the government cover to undertake an action that might be unpopular with the local Indigenous community. The assertion, therefore, is that the voice would not represent all Indigenous Australians, and in particular could enable the government to undertake actions that particularly harm specific Indigenous Australians. Now, this itself seems to rest on the assumption that either A, the voice is going to be perhaps co-opted or corrupted by the government, and or B, the voice is perhaps going to act in a utilitarian manner, where it might balance good and bad points of a policy, which might ultimately harm an underlying constituent. Now, the main caveat to the argument is that the government would still likely need to consult the underlying people that are impacted. So going back to our resources example, if the government wants to increase resources activity in a particular area, it is likely going to need to consult that underlying group of people. This is because failure to do so would likely be judiciable. That is, the government then would have failed to consider a relevant matter when making a decision. Now, perhaps the government, when defending the case, could argue that they consulted the voice, and in the media they could certainly argue that the voice had enabled them to undertake a particular activity. So even if the government were ultimately held to be at fault, they could argue they did some consultation, but the consultation failed, and then they could pass the buck. However, if the voice itself undertook inadequate consultation, well, that's unlikely to actually help the government in court. But that notwithstanding, many local communities probably don't have the resources to actually be able to challenge a government decision. It's not exactly a quick, easy, or cheap thing to challenge a government decision, and therefore there is a concern that the voice might enable the government to undertake adverse actions. Third, there's the argument that the voice can't possibly represent all Indigenous Australians. Now, this seems to overlap with an argument put by the Standard No campaign. That is, that the voice would not be truly representative, and that many Indigenous Australians would simply be disenfranchised by the voice. Now, there seems to be a slightly different spin put on this by either the Progressive or the Standard No campaign, but in any case, there is a degree of overlap. The underlying concern is that if people don't have confidence in how the government is operating, and don't have confidence in the government's ability or willingness to structure the voice in a manner that properly considers all Indigenous communities, then it might simply consider the viewpoints of specific Indigenous Australians. For example, those who are living in city locations. Now, that is a concern. The government should have tried to address this in advance through legislation. The government should have tried to address this by making it clear exactly how they were going to try to appoint people. Because at the moment, people are just imagining how it is going to work, which enables people to perhaps think about the worst possible conclusions. Now, one can see a bit of a parallel to this in our parliamentary system. So we've got the House of Representatives and the Senate in the federal government. The House of Representatives has members and constituents that are elected roughly in proportion to the population of each state. The Senate, however, has the same number of representatives for each state. So in this case, say we only had the House of Representatives. Well, here, the large states such as New South Wales and Victoria would have more representatives. This would enable New South Wales and Victoria to dominate Tasmania in policy setting. This is why we have the Senate to help to offset this. Now, this system doesn't necessarily resolve all such problems, but it is an attempt to do so. Now, of course, the government might claim that when they're structuring the voice and structuring how the members are chosen, then it might have a House of Representatives Senate type system. It might have perhaps people popularly elected based on perhaps geographic distributions of individuals, and then maybe a Senate-like structure that might represent people simply based on locations, not in proportion to the population from those locations. However, again, we don't necessarily know how it is going to operate at this point. And whether or not you think the government will do that or not depends on how much faith you actually have in the government to design the voice. Now, I have some degree of sympathy for this progressive no argument. For example, many of you are probably members of a trade or a profession. Now, most trades and professions have peak bodies. This is the case for law or for medicine or really anything else. There's a group that purports to represent all members of that trade. But you have to ask yourself, how exactly is that leadership team selected? Does that leadership team represent you? When that peak body takes a position, do all the members actually agree with it? Do even a majority agree with it? Because the leadership team oftentimes is not directly, or at least not frequently accountable to the members, and they can take a position on a particular issue and still get elected because no one else is running against them. Now, this could plausibly be the case with the voice entity depending on how it is structured. It is important to structure the voice properly to avoid those types of situations occurring. And like I've indicated, whether or not you think the government is going to do so depends on how much faith you actually have in the government. Now, those overall appear to be the core progressive no arguments. Effectively, it's an argument that the voice might not go far enough and or the voice might disenfranchise Indigenous Australians and or it might be seen as cover for the government to make decisions that might not actually benefit Indigenous Australians. I.e., the voice is simply not actually helping the people it pretends to help. That at least appears to be the core of the progressive no argument, with several strands underlying it. Now, if you think I've missed anything, or if you disagree with my characterization, well, let me know that in the comments below. But otherwise, I hope this video has been informative to you.